I made a mistake last Tuesday. I called customer service. I know, I should have known better. At my age, you learn there are certain things you simply don't do. You don't eat anything that says, "do not eat." You don't buy furniture that says, "some assembly required." And you don't call customer service unless you're prepared to lose an afternoon. I had a problem with my internet bill. It was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just wrong enough to make me angry. It was $14.73 higher than usual. My wife said, "Call them." I said, "I don't want to." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I know how this ends." She said, "It's a phone call." I said, "No." She looked at me. I looked at her. She said, "Just call." So I called, and that's how the day disappeared. The first thing I heard was a recording. "Thank you for calling." Fine. "Your call is important to us." I already knew that was a lie, because if my call was important, somebody would answer it.
Then the voice said, "For quality assurance, this call may be recorded." I thought, good, because if anything happens to me, we have evidence. Then, "Please listen carefully as our menu options have changed." Of course they have. They change the menu every time. I called the same company 6 months ago. It was completely different. I'm beginning to think they're not solving problems. They're just moving the buttons around. The recording says, "Press 1 for English." I pressed 1. Then it said, "For Spanish, press 2." I didn't press anything. Then it said, "For all other languages, press 3." I thought, what does that mean? What happens if I press 3? Do I get Klingon? Eventually it said, "If you're calling about billing, press 4." I pressed 4. "I'm sorry, I didn't get that." I said, "I pressed 4." The robot said, "If you're calling about billing, press 4." I pressed 4 again. It said, "Thank you." I said, "You're welcome." I don't know why I said that. There was nobody there.
But I felt we had reached an understanding. Then it asked for the last 4 digits of my social security number. I entered them. The robot said, "I'm sorry, we didn't recognize that." I said, "What?" It said, "Please try again." I entered them again. Same numbers, same social security number, same me. It said, "We still don't recognize that." I thought, neither do I anymore. Maybe I'm not me. Maybe somebody stole my identity. Maybe the person calling customer service is actually the criminal. I was starting to question everything. Then it asked for my date of birth. Easy. I know my birthday. I've had it for 68 years. I entered it. It said, "Please enter your date of birth using 2 digits for the month, 2 digits for the day, and 4 digits for the year." I did. Then, "I'm sorry, we didn't recognize that." I said, "It was my birthday." The robot didn't respond. I thought, this company doesn't even celebrate birthdays. After about 9 minutes, a human answered. "Thank you for calling. My name is Jessica. How can I help you today?" I almost cried. I said, "Jessica?" She said, "Yes?" I said, "I've been waiting for you." There was a pause. She said, "Okay." I said, "I don't think you understand." She said, "I'm listening." I said, "You're the first person I've spoken to." She said, "Okay." I said, "There's been a lot of questions." She said, "Okay." I said, "Some of them I couldn't answer." She said, "Okay." I said, "Then the robot got angry." She said, "Okay." I said, "And now we're here." Another pause. She said, "Okay." I thought, She's been trained well. I explained the bill. She said, "Absolutely, I'd be happy to help you with that." That sentence gave me hope. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Before I can access your account, I need to verify your information." I said, "Okay." She asked for my name. I gave it. Address. I gave it. Phone number. I gave it. Email address. I gave it. Last 4 digits of social security number. I gave it.
Date of birth. I gave it. Then she said, "And can you confirm your mother's maiden name?" I said, "Why?" She said, "It's for security." I said, "Jessica." "Yes?" "If somebody has my mother's maiden name." "Yes?" "I think we've got bigger problems than the internet bill." She laughed. I laughed. For a moment, we were friends. She said, "Thank you. I just need to verify one more thing." Of course, one more thing. There is always one more thing. She asked, "What was the name of your first pet?" I said, "Buddy." She said, "I'm sorry, that doesn't match." I said, "What?" She said, "It doesn't match our records." I said, "My first pet was Buddy." She said, "Okay." I said, "He was a dog." She said, "Okay." I said, "We had him for 11 years." She said, "Okay." I said, "I was 8 years old." She said, "Okay." I said, "Are you suggesting I don't remember my first dog?" She said, "No." I said, "Because I remember Buddy." She said, "I'm sure you do." I said, "Jessica." "Yes?" "Buddy remembers me." She laughed again. I think she was beginning to enjoy the call. Then she said, "I'm going to transfer you to our billing department." I said, "Wait. Yes? Why?" She said, "Because billing handles billing." I said, "Don't you handle billing?" She said, "I handle customer service." I said, "Isn't billing customer service?" She paused. I think I'd asked a philosophical question. She said, "I'll transfer you." And suddenly I was listening to music. The hold music was terrible. It sounded like somebody had taught a piano to apologize. Same 4 notes, over and over. After 5 minutes, my wife walked into the room. She said, "Are you still on the phone?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Waiting." "For what?" I said, "I don't know." She looked at me. Then she said, "Did you fix the bill?" I said, "I haven't spoken to billing yet." She said, "How long have you been on the phone?" I looked at the clock. 27 minutes.
I said, 27 minutes. She said, "And what have they done?" I said, "They've learned a lot about me." Eventually, somebody answered, "Thank you for calling billing. My name is Mark." I said, "Mark." "Yes?" "I'm glad you're here." He said, "Thank you." I said, "Jessica sent me." He said, "Okay." I said, "She was very nice." He said, "That's good." I said, "She asked me a lot of questions." He said, "Okay." I said, "Some were personal." He said, "Okay." I said, "She knows my mother's maiden name." He said, "Okay." I said, "She knows about Buddy." He said, "Okay." I said, "And now you're the one who gets the bill." He said, "Yes." I said, "Good luck." I explained everything again. Mark said, "Let me pull up your account." I waited. He said, "I see the charge." I said, "Great." He said, "It's a $14.73 equipment fee." I said, "I don't have any new equipment." He said, "Did you recently upgrade your modem?" "No." "Did you add any equipment?" "No." "Did you replace anything?" "No." He said, I said, "What?"
He said, "It looks like you have a modem." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's equipment." I said, "I know." He said, "So there is equipment." I said, "Yes." He said, "Then the fee is correct." I said, "Mark." "Yes?" "I've had that modem for 6 years." He said, "Okay." I said, "Why did you start charging me for it now?" Silence. Then, "I don't know." I said, "Finally." A man who didn't know. I trusted him immediately. Mark said, "I can transfer you to a supervisor." I said, "Why?" He said, "They may be able to remove the fee." I said, "Are you allowed to remove it?" "No." "Can Jessica remove it?" "No." "Can your supervisor remove it?" "Yes." I said, "Then why didn't we start there?" Silence. He said, "I'll transfer you." Of course. More music. My wife walked past. She looked at me. She didn't say anything. She just pointed at the phone, then pointed at the clock, then pointed at me. She was doing math. I said, "It's almost done."
She said, "You said that 40 minutes ago." I said, "I've learned not to make promises." She walked away. I respect that woman. Finally, "Hello, my name is David. I'm a supervisor." I said, "David?" "Yes?" "I've been transferred 3 times." He said, "I apologize." I said, "It's okay." He said, "I'm going to take care of this for you." I said, "Are you sure?" "Yes." I said, "Because Jessica knew my birthday." "Okay." "Mark knew about my modem." "Okay." "You're the supervisor." "Yes." I said, "You have a lot of responsibility." He laughed. I think David liked me. David said, "I see the problem." I said, "Great." He said, "The equipment fee was added by mistake." I said, "I knew it." He said, "I can remove it." I said, "Wonderful." He removed it. Then he said, "I've also credited your account $14.73. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" I said, "No." I was free. I had survived. I was emotional. I thanked David. I thanked Jessica in my mind. I thanked Mark. I thanked Buddy. I was about to hang up, then David said, "Before you go," I knew. I knew something was coming. He said, "Would you like to upgrade your internet plan?" I said, "David." "Yes?" "I've been on the phone for 1 hour and 6 minutes." "Yes." "You've just told me you made a mistake." "Yes." "You've credited me $14.73. "Yes." "And now you're asking me if I want to give you more money?" "Yes." I said, "David, this is like a burglar fixing the window after breaking into your house and then asking if you'd like better locks." There was silence. Then David laughed. I laughed. And then he said, "That's actually a good analogy." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Would you like me to note that on your account?" I said, "No." I finally hung up. My wife walked in. She said, "Did you fix it?" I said, "Yes." "How much did they charge you?" "Nothing." "Good." I sat down. She looked at me. She said, "How long did it take?" I said, 1 hour and 6 minutes. She said, "For $14?" I said, "Yes." She stared at me. Then she said, "You could have just paid the $14." I said, "No." "Why?" I thought about it, and I realized this wasn't about the money. It was about justice. It was about principle. It was about standing up for yourself. It was about refusing to let a corporation take $14 from an innocent man. My wife looked at me. She said, "You spent an hour proving you were right about $14. I said, "Yes." She said, "And you think that was worth it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because now they know I'm watching." She walked away. 5 minutes later, she came back. She said, "Did you remember to pay the electricity bill?" I said, "No." She said, "It's due today." I said, "Okay." She said, "Call them." I said, "No." She said, "Why?" I said, "I'm not going through that again." She said, "It's an automated system." I said, "I don't trust it."
And that's when I realized something. At 68, I've become very good at choosing my battles. I don't care about a lot of things anymore. I don't care if somebody thinks my shirt is fashionable. I don't care if my phone is the newest model. I don't care what people think about my car. But if a corporation charges me $14.73 by mistake, oh no, that's different. That's personal. I'll spend an hour on the phone. I'll verify my identity. I'll answer questions about my childhood. I'll explain my relationship with Buddy. I'll survive hold music. I'll speak to 3 departments. I'll meet a supervisor. I'll fight. Because I have principles. And also, I have nowhere to be. That's retirement. So if you're ever thinking about calling customer service, don't. Just pay the $14.73. Because somewhere out there, there's a 68-year-old man named me, still on hold, trying to get his $14 back. And if they ask for the name of his first pet, tell them, Buddy. He'll know. Good night, everybody.